So this morning, God of the Desperate, we're going to be looking at Genesis 38. It's very likely you've never heard this passage talked about before in church. If you're new, of course not. But even if you've been to church a lot of times, you may not have, and you may never hear it again at Coast. This is a challenging passage. It's this woman named Tamar, whose story is super desperate. It's so desperate that a lot of people don't even like to talk about it. And a lot of people who write about this passage are like, this is super weird. We don't know why it's in the Bible. I literally have a couple books on Genesis that were like, we don't know how this got in here, and we're sorry. It's kind of like, why is this in here? But we're going to read that this morning. And in the midst of it, I think there's an incredible story of redemption and hope that we don't want to lose sight of. We don't want to lose sight of the fact that God is at work in desperate people's lives, and that God is at work in messy ways, and God is often way more comfortable in messes than we are. I think if any of us wrote the story of Tamar, whether or not you're a follower of Jesus, whether or not you have any particular spirituality, if you wanted to write a story of redemption, just with that theme, about a woman named Tamar, you would change the story. Because it's just too messy for us, and you'll see why in a minute if you don't know the story. But we'll dive into it. I want to start, though, with a video of a pretty terrible movie with a pretty good scene. So this is 45 seconds. This is all you need to see of the movie Vertical Limit. If you've never seen it, this is enough for you. And there you go. I love that one scene. Sometimes life is like that, isn't it? Isn't life like this sometimes? Sometimes you feel like you're just running and you jump off the cliff and it's like, ah! And it's just all desperation. Aren't there times like that? Last week, our youngest daughter, our only daughter, our youngest child, got her driver's license. And she, immediately wants to go out and drive. Great, does a little drive, and then it gets dark, and then she's like, can I go back to the mall? We're like, why do you want to go back to the mall? Well, obviously, just to drive. She could have gone. I think the mall was the first place that just came to her mind. Basically, can I go for a drive? But it was after dark, and Michelle and I looked at each other, and this was the feeling we had, like, ah! If you're a parent for the first time and your child wants to drive on Interstate 8 after dark, it was like, we're just all in right now. We're all in. We're just hoping that the ice axes hit something and we hang on. We're just like terrified, like, ah! Sometimes, like if you're raising kids and picking a school, or you get 2 job offers and it's like, ah, just hanging on. I don't know about you, but I've had some conversations post-election, some family conversations. Perhaps you have a homogenous family where everybody agrees, but we don't have one like that. And Thanksgiving, someone can say something and all of a sudden it feels like this, doesn't it? It just feels like, am I gonna say something? I'm just gonna put my relationships on the line right now. Did it feel that way? Like, do I say something? Do I not say something? Okay, I'm going all in. I'm just saying something. I'm jumping off. I'm just hoping this relationship survives. I read this morning that almost 90% of Republicans, almost 90% of Democrats, and almost 90% of independents agree on one thing, and that's that we're a divided nation, right? So if we just take a poll, there's this profound sense of division. So our conversations, but on a deeper level, sometimes life feels very desperate, like a decision is just all in. Like if a marriage is starting to come apart, sometimes it feels like this conversation, we are all in, like everything is at stake. There's times when we have a friend who gets a diagnosis and all of a sudden life feels so desperate. For some of us, we're going into the holidays having lost a family member. And it just feels desperate, like how am I going to do this? Sometimes life is really desperate. And this morning we're going to read about a really desperate woman who makes a desperate decision that God works in the midst of. I want to pray and then read Genesis 38. Lord, I ask that you would open our hearts to your word. Lord, would you help us to not only read your word and understand your word, but Lord, would you shape our lives? And Lord, I ask that hope would take hold of us. And Holy Spirit, would you work in the deep places of our heart? In your name, Jesus. Amen. This is a longer passage than we usually read, but to get the sort of picture of what happens here, we need a little bit more than usual. So hang in there. This is Genesis 38. Then Judah, who is one of the sons of Jacob, Judah is a man who's an inheritor of God's promise. God said, I'm going to bless the nations through Abraham and through Isaac and through Jacob. And Judah is one of the 12 sons of Jacob. And so Judah is the inheritor of God's promise and supposed to be sort of a guy who's living in the midst of that promise. We'll see he's having some trouble. Then Judah said to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, go back to your parents there and remain a widow until my son Shelah is old enough to marry you. Now that's a weird opening sentence. A little bit of background. Judah has a couple of kids, and Tamar marries one of his sons, and that son is so wicked that God slays him. So it's this disturbing passage. So there's some sort of horrendous moral problem that we don't even find out about. Then she marries a second son named Onan, and he takes advantage of Tamar in a horrible way, and he is also killed. And so she's been widowed twice. Undoubtedly, she's a woman full of all kinds of grief, and part of God's sort of deal with his people in the ancient world, God said, if there's a widow in a family with another son remaining, that son, and she's childless, that son needs to marry the widow in order that she can still have offspring. And so Judah says, wait until Shelah is old enough to marry you so that Tamar can have the children that were rightfully hers. But Judah, and so let's continue, but Judah didn't really intend to do this because he was afraid Shelah would also die like his two brothers. So Tamar went back to live in her father's home. Some years later, Judah's wife died, and after the time of mourning was over, Judah and his friend Hira the Adullamite went up to Timnah to supervise the shearing of his sheep. Someone told Tamar, look, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep. Tamar was aware that Shelah had grown up, but no arrangements had been made for her to come and marry him. So, just to unpack this, she realizes, right, I'm the victim of injustice. She realizes my father-in-law is not going to be good to his word. She realizes that the marriage she was promised is not coming. So she changed out of her widow's clothing and covered herself with a veil to disguise herself. Then she sat beside the road at the entrance to the village of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. Judah noticed her and thought she was a prostitute since she had covered her face. This is where the story gets kind of crazy. So if you're new to the Bible, this is really in it, okay? So he stopped and propositioned her, let me have sex with you, which is pretty direct, right? He said, not realizing that she was his own daughter-in-law. So this is nuts. How much will you pay me to have sex with me? Tamar asked. I'll send you a young goat from my flock, Judah promised. So he doesn't have the goat with her. But what will you give me to guarantee that you will send the goat, she asked. What kind of guarantee do you want? He replied. She answered, leave me your identification seal and its cord and the walking stick you are carrying. Modern paraphrase, this is my paraphrase. I want your driver's license and your visa. That's basically in the ancient world. The seal is what would identify you and allow you to pay for things. So she's like, give me your personal identification and your means of payment. So she's smart. She's asking for the things that really matter. So Judah gave them to her, and then he had intercourse with her, and she became pregnant. Why are we reading this in Advent right now? What's going on? Afterwards, she went back home, took off her veil, and put on her widow's clothing as usual. Later, Judah asked his father, Hira the Adullamite, to take the young goat to the woman and pick up the things that he had given her as her guarantee, but Hira couldn't find her, so he asked the men who lived there, where can I find the shrine prostitute? Here's 10 seconds of history, but it's interesting, at least for a couple of you. Originally, he recognizes her, and in Hebrew, the word's a common prostitute. So she's dressed like a common prostitute, which means she had a pretty low opinion of Judah. Like, if I'm just a common roadside prostitute, he'll proposition me. And he did. So that tells you something about her estimation of her father-in-law. But now he wants to look good. There was a practice when it was like harvest time that you would sleep with a sort of a religious prostitute in order to get blessing, and that was socially acceptable. So Hira says, have you seen the socially acceptable prostitute? Basically. That's my paraphrase again. That's probably not in your version, but that's what he's saying. So Hira returned to Judah and told him, I couldn't find her anywhere, and the men of the village claim they've never had a shrine prostitute there. There are no socially acceptable prostitutes. There's occasionally common prostitutes, but there's none of the kind of bless your crops, socially acceptable prostitutes here. Then, keep the things I gave her, Judah said. I sent the young goat as we agreed, but you couldn't find her. We'll be a laughingstock of the village if we went back to look for her again. So Judah's trying to hide what he's done. Like, okay, ruse over, forget about it. I'll just give up my identification seal. Forget the visa and the driver's license. I don't want to be a laughingstock. I'm already in this deeper than I want to be. About 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has acted like a prostitute, and now, because of this, she's pregnant. Bring her out and let her be burned, Judah demanded, which is actually nowhere in Old Covenant law, by the way. This is just Judah in a rage. But as they were taking her out to kill her, she sent this message to her father-in-law. The man who owns these things made me pregnant. That's a clever way of saying it, right? Look closely. Whose seal and cord and walking stick are these? Judah recognized them and immediately and said, she is more righteous than I am because I didn't arrange for her to marry my son Shelah, and Judah never slept with Tamar again. Okay, I promised you it would be messy, right? It's so messy. All right, let's just do a quick reality check. We're going to walk through this passage, and I hope by the end of it you see that this is actually, there's a story of hope and a story of redemption in the midst of this passage that seems almost too messy for Hollywood, right? This is kind of off the chart. A quick reality check. Sometimes all of our relationships are messy. The 4 women we're going to look at this month each have stories, I'm sure, spoken over their lives. You'll see Rahab and Ruth and Bathsheba. You can only imagine what people would have said about Tamar. She's a widow. She's had 2 of her husbands have been slain by God. I don't know how that looked in the moment. I don't know what happened to them. But you can imagine what people might have said about Tamar. But what we know is that she had one husband who was really horrible and he died, and she had another husband who actually really abused her, took advantage of her sexually, and did horrible things really, and he died. And she has a father-in-law who's supposed to protect her and provide for her and who is just cheating her. And so all of her relationships are really, really a mess. And as far as we know, it's through no fault of her own. And I think the reality of life sometimes is that our relationships can get super messy. And we can be right in the midst of the promise of God. We can be followers of Jesus in the midst of very messy relationships. As we go into the holidays, oftentimes the messiness of our relationships that we avoid for 11 months of the year comes front and center. And families that are split and fights that have been had and things that have been said all of a sudden become front and center. I remember when I was a kid, there was one uncle who played with us so much. He taught me to throw a football. He played different monster games with us. He was the coolest uncle. And all of our kids, if any of us got to nominate who is your coolest relative, all of us would have said the same guy. He is our coolest relative. but he really was unfaithful to my aunt, who was my mom's sister, and he became like, he left and divorced my aunt, and it was a huge mess. And I remember as a kid feeling like if I even mention that I like him, it's like disloyalty. And so now do I have to say he's horrible? Or when people would say he's horrible, I used to want to say, but wait, he's the only one who ever taught me to throw a ball. You know, and all of a sudden it can feel like if I have a loyalty over here, then I'm disloyalty over here. If I even say that this person is okay, then it feels like I'm betraying this person over here. Some of us know what it's like to feel in the midst of relationships that are super messy. And where it feels like there's no good answer here. These relationships, it's like a beautiful window that's been broken. And it's the Humpty Dumpty, there's no putting it all back together, so it's the same way. Some of us going into the holidays have that feeling of brokenness that the relationships I'm walking into are really broken. And I would want to just suggest for us as we go in that Tamar's right there, that her relationships are all messy. There's none of them that seem particularly healthy or whole. Okay, second part of the reality check. Sometimes all of our choices are messy. The truth about life is it's not always obvious which is the good choice or which is the righteous choice or which is the moral high ground choice or which is the choice that God would want us to make or which is the choice that good people would make. Sometimes none of the choices look good. Tamar is a widow. She has no children. I think whatever other people might have said about her, I think if we were to listen to sort of the voice inside her head, I think she would have said, I'm a desperate woman. She was desperate for children. And she probably knew that she was an inheritor of God's promise. And it wasn't just that she wanted children, but justice meant in the ancient world, justice meant that she should have been provided a husband. And she should have been provided an opportunity to have children. That's what God's law said for her. And so there's part of her, I'm sure, that said, if I am to be faithful to sort of what God's plan says about my family, then how can I even get there? Because the people around me, my father-in-law, who is supposed to be the provider, is actually systematically cheating. Is it more just to just live under systematic injustice or to take a radical step? Which is the more just thing? You see, sometimes everything feels very messy. And I think sometimes we tell ourselves if we live like good lives, if we, in a Christian narrative, if we follow Jesus, then the good choice will be obvious. But I don't think that's always true. Sometimes it's really unclear. And, even on a little level, like I was talking to a relative at Thanksgiving, and just to touch politics again, we started talking, and you can almost, there's like a gravity, isn't there, right now? You can kind of tell in a conversation, oh no, I'm trying to steer, like if you're in a skid and you're trying to steer the other way, like, And all of a sudden there was sort of a narrative of like, basically, I'll just paraphrase this, basically Christians elected the president-elect because they're hateful. And I thought, how do I respond to that right now? And I'm an internal processor. How do I know, Jesus, wait, there's so many levels. And for me, I would have liked like 5 minutes to go away and to pray and to think about a response, because I'm an internal processor. I don't just say, like, I'm just thinking, and then it's like, I got to say something right now. And then the conversation went more and more, and I just felt this pressure building up in me like it was like a grenade. Like, what am I going to say? And I feel bad if I don't say anything. And no matter where I jump in, it feels like terrible. Did it? Nobody else? Yes? Somebody had a conversation like that this weekend where it just felt like, what am I going to say? And where no matter what I say, wait, I don't want to throw all Christians under the, wait, I agree with that, I don't agree with that, wait. If I start in from this angle of agreement, then wait, no, that's not what I meant. No, I'll start in over here, no. And it feels like, what do I say that might really represent, I just went with point to Jesus, like Jesus. And then I was like, that felt weird. But what do I do? Sometimes everything feels messy. Tamar had no good choices. And if you think you're out of good choices, you can just remember Tamar and think, my choices are better than Tamar's choices. Seriously. Okay. Now I want, just before walking through this passage a little more, there's one other place in the Bible where Tamar is mentioned. It's Matthew 1. This is the genealogy. I'm going to condense it. There are actually 42 generations in this genealogy, but this is condensed to, a more palatable number. This is the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, Judah the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar, Perez the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab, Boaz the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. David was the father of Solomon, whose mother had been Uriah's wife. So there's the four women we're going to talk about. Solomon the father of Rehoboam, Rehoboam the father of Abijah, Mathan the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, and Mary was the mother of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. And so we see that Tamar, this desperate woman, ended up having twins, and that from her twins came King David, that her line was a royal line, and that from her children the promise to the nations was carried down generation after generation through David all the way to Jesus, God's Messiah. So a key insight: God rewrites stories of desperation into stories of destiny. She goes from desperation to actually salvation open to every tribe and every tongue and every nation. That is Tamar's legacy. And I want to look just briefly then at this journey this journey of going from desperation to destiny. How does God do that? So three things here. One is that God is at work where we don't see it. If you asked Tamar, how is God at work in your life? I don't know what she would have said. I think maybe she had heard her family talk about the promise made to her great-grandfather Abraham. I bet she knew that her family somehow was the inheritor of an amazing promise that they were supposed to be blessing to every nation on the earth. But I wonder if she had completely lost track of that. And if you ask the people around Tamar, how is God at work in Tamar's life? I think almost all of them would have said, she's just way out there. She's completely left the ranch. She's gone in an unexplainable direction. And yet what we see is that in the midst of the mess, God is at work. In the midst of her broken choice, God is working to fulfill the promise he made to Abraham, when it seems like all of Abraham's great-grandkids don't want to hold on to the promise they've been given. God is actually at work bringing it to pass. And I think there's a reminder for us that there's times when we can't see God at work in our lives, and that doesn't mean God isn't actually at work. Just because the lights go out doesn't mean God's at work. If you're new to faith and new to spirituality, just because you don't maybe recognize where God has been in your life, that doesn't mean that God hasn't been chasing you down and even at work in your life. I had one reminder of this just a couple of weeks ago. I talked to a person who I didn't recognize at all. And they came up to me and they gave me a hug and they started to weep. And I had no idea what was going on. And I was like, what is happening here? This is a weird thing. And they said, several years ago, I spoke not at Coast, somewhere else, on a night I don't even remember. And they said, I had just experienced this terrible trauma, and I had committed that week to take my life. And that night, God spoke to me. I decided not to. It was like one of the most encouraging things I've heard. If I didn't have any idea God might have been working there, I didn't have any idea that someone's life was profoundly touched. I didn't, it's maybe just one of those God moments that we ever met again. But I want to say to you, a lot of times you may pray for someone, you may give someone a hug, you may sit down with someone and listen to them and encourage them, and it may have a transformational power in their life or in the life of someone they talk to, far beyond anything you ever see. There may be a legacy far beyond, and I think God almost delights in hiding the things he's doing. I think it actually saves us from pride in a way, we don't want to know too much of the things we're doing to bless the world. I think there's almost a protection sometimes that we don't know. And yet what we see in Tamar is that God is at work in a way she would never have guessed in the moment. In retrospect, God is powerfully at work, bringing salvation to the earth through her. That's crazy, isn't it? And yet she, almost for sure wasn't aware of it in the moment. Okay. So God's at work where we don't see it. Second one, God will honor faithfulness. There's a highlight verse. I think the verse that stands out in the whole chapter, almost none of this chapter is ever going to make it onto the refrigerator magnets that I love so much. In fact, it would be super weird. You could start that as an alternative refrigerator magnet company. Genesis 38 refrigerator magnets. She is more righteous than I am, because I didn't arrange for her to marry my son. Serious scholars of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, will tell you that you can't understand righteousness unless you understand this verse. Whatever righteousness means, whatever the Hebrew word tzedakah, whatever that means, Tamar is the more righteous one. She was faithful to the covenant with the living God. She made a desperate decision. She disguised herself as a prostitute. She seduced her father-in-law, none of which sounds righteous. But that chain of decisions was more righteous than Judah, who was willing to cheat his daughter. And there's something about faithfulness that's at the very heart of what it means to live a righteous life. To be faithful to the covenant with God. You can almost define righteousness, covenant faithfulness. She's the more righteous one. And in Matthew 1, where we see Tamar listed as in the line of Jesus, I think the reason that she's highlighted, no small part of it, is she made this desperate decision, but it was a decision that was faithful to God's covenant promise to her. She was supposed to have a son through that family, or a child at least through that family, and she ended up having twins. And so that sort of desperate faithfulness turns out to be honored. And whenever we say to ourselves, no matter what, I'm going to be faithful, and sometimes, it almost feels like impossibly messy faithfulness here, but God honors it. And then finally, this is 3, not 2. God is able to give us a legacy beyond our ability. Never forget that God is able to move through us, to bring life through us, to bring profound transformation through us, far beyond our own gifts and abilities and circumstances. I think our culture will say to you, if you look at your gifts and if you look at your experience, if you look at sort of your talent level, that really added up is like what you have to give to this world. And that's just not true. Because God's able to do far more through us than we're able to do on our own. Tamar, her legacy is sick people being healed and enemies being loved and sins being forgiven. That's her legacy through her family line. Far beyond what she had in and of herself. And as we look forward to the coming of Jesus together, we hold up this promise that God is able to do far more through us as a community than we're able to do in and of ourselves. The sum is far greater than just the aggregate of the parts. We took a quick hike through the Sequoias this week on a bonsai road trip that our family loves, and we found ourselves hiking in a grove, and there was several redwoods all together that were super tall, and there was a little sign. I'm a geek. I go off, I read all the signs. Everybody else is walking by iPhones, iPads, selfie sticks. I read the signs. And the sign said, whenever you see several tall sequoias together, you know they're the same age. Because very often when there's a severe fire that burns everything down, the seeds are released, and because there's no competition, that's where the tallest trees grow. So it's after a severe fire, when everything's gone, that the very tallest trees grow, and they tend to grow together because there's no competition. And so the tallest, this grove is the grove of overall, not the single largest tree, but groups of the largest trees in the whole world. And they're there because there was a severe fire. And I thought, that actually is like a metaphor for what's going on with Tamar. Like when there's these severe fires that make our lives look really desperate, when everything seems like it's burnt down, that's often where God is moving in ways that we would never guess, and in ways that end up being towering and providing life, shelter, and shade for many, many people. I was thinking about the division. You guys see the Amazon commercial with the pastor and the imam sending each other gifts? There's a commercial. So I just watched this commercial. I saw that commercial Thursday night. So pastor and mom sending each other gifts via Amazon. Of course, Amazon's in the middle of it, like world peace comes through Amazon. Totally the whole picture. But the thing that struck me is this commercial, which is obviously sort of their best holiday effort in the wake of the election, is just like saying the world is dying to see peace and reconciliation between Muslims and Christians. Jeff Bezos, a well-known, agnostic secular dude who is, doing his part to champion secular humanism, is sort of broadcasting for our nation that, look, we're all hungry to see Christians and Muslims get along. This is what we're hungry for. Well, a week ago, Thursday, Michelle and I spent all morning with Imam Taha from next door and a group of pastors praying about what would it look like for us to peacemake in our city together. What would it look like for us to stand out from the division? And I thought, in the midst of all of the divisiveness, we have an opportunity to stand out as followers of Jesus. We have an opportunity to say together, we're part of a different narrative. We're not part of a narrative of division. We're not part of a narrative of fear. We're part of a narrative of peacemaking. We're part of a narrative where Jesus is on the move in our city, where we're building friendships with Muslim neighbors, where we're working together, actually, different tribes within the body of Christ along with Muslims, and we want to bless our city. We're actually quite intent on it. And I think in sort of the wreckage of the divisiveness, there's a real opportunity for us to shine right now. Do you know that just by saying something positive in your workplace, you can shine right now? Just by saying something positive at a family gathering. Actually, we're working with our friends to make peace in our city. That stands out like crazy. I want to close with this verse. It's jumping forward in Matthew 1 from the genealogy we read. This is the verse that Ari read beautifully this morning. She will give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus, because he will save people from his sins. Let's all stand. Worship team, if you guys could come on up. We're going to sing one last song together. But as we do that, I want to just ask us, if you were to write a 1 or 2 line story about yourself, what would it be right now? All of us have stories spoken over us. All of us tell ourselves stories. And again, I think if it was Tamar, she might say, I am a desperate woman. What would you write? As your kind of 1-sentence story, a 1-sentence where I am in life. So what Tamar didn't guess is that her story could equally well be written, I am the great-great-grandmother, great-great-great-great-grandmother, Messiah. I am the woman through whom God's promise to every tribe and to every tongue and to every nation flows. It all flows through Tamar and many other people, but she is just right in the midst of God's grace to this world. As we worship, I want to just invite the Spirit of God to rewrite the things that need to be rewritten. To take us out of a story of desperation. I'm in the midst of brokenness. I'm in the midst of emptiness. Some of us might say, God has nothing to do with my story. Tamar might have said, God has nothing to do with my story. And then God rewrote her story. And my prayer is that God would rewrite our stories and aim us right at Jesus, the hope of the nations. So Lord, would you fill us as we worship? Would you breathe on us now, Holy Spirit? Let's worship. We could get the prayer team to come in. Every week we have an opportunity for anyone to get prayer for anything they want to. Come in this week feeling like life is a mess. We would love to pray for you. I think there's at least a couple of people coming in. I just had a sort of a drumbeat question as we were worshiping at the beginning of the service. Just asking, where are you, God? Where are you, God? Where are you, God? That's just a question that's been beating in your heart. We'd love to just pray with you, for you. Where are you, God? We'd love to pray for you. If you're new to faith, if you're at maybe the very beginning of a spiritual journey, we'd love to pray for you. As Patrick said, coming to the table, it can even be a simple step. Jesus, would you come into my life? That's a beginning prayer that's just explosively powerful. When prayed with faith, it can change our lives forever. Let's all hold hands across the aisles. We do this each week as a reminder that we are a community. We're a community of love. We are unified by Jesus our Lord, who gives us his one Spirit. The Bible says we are a community with one faith, one Spirit, and one Lord. Lord, thank you that our hope is in you. Thank you. Lord, would you shine through us? Would you shine through us in our diversity, Lord? Would you shine through us in our grief and in our hope, in our disappointments and in our dreams? Would you shine through us, Jesus? Would you work your blessing into this world through our body, Lord, through your body, the church? We love you and we go out in your name. Amen. God bless you guys. If you'd like prayer, come on up for anything at all. If you're sick, we'd love to pray for you. Just anything going on. If you're headed out, have a great week.